BBC Sounds. Music, radio, podcasts.
Hello and welcome to the Farming Today podcast with me, Charlotte Smith. Coming up in this episode, an uncertain future for UK peatlands.
I'm very worried about the findings of the study. Peatlands are a carbon asset that we really can't afford to lose.
Should bottom trawling be banned?
A total ban could actually lead to unforeseen and unwanted consequential effects. So, for example, the displacement of fishing activities into other areas.
And from the Punjab to the Vale of Evesham.
We're farmers. Our songs are about farming, music, food, everything is about farming, and yet we come over here and we're totally different.
First, farming leaders have said they left a much-anticipated meeting with the Treasury this week with their blood boiling, claiming the government has shut the door on any rethink of planned changes to inheritance tax on farms. Representatives from agricultural organisations met the Exchequer Secretary, James Murray, and Farming Minister Daniel Zeichner on Tuesday. It follows months of protests over plans for inherited agricultural assets worth more than £1 million to be taxed at 20%. Half the usual rate, from April next year. Well, as we've reported many times, farming groups fear the plans risk the breakup of family farms and will disproportionately affect elderly farmers without time to plan. But the government told us it strongly believes this is a fair and balanced approach which helps fix the public services we all rely on. Well, speaking at a press conference after the meeting, Victoria Vivian, president of the Country Land and Business Association, said she felt the Treasury officials didn't understand what was being said to them.
They were just adamant and deaf to what we were trying to say. And I think we all came out slightly with boiling blood about it, because we offered them a solution which has the same outcome, which makes you feel that there is ideology running behind this. And I haven't wanted to say that before today, but the money isn't big enough to justify the attack on our industry.
George Dunn, the chief executive of the Tenant Farmers Association, said calls for a consultation on how the changes could impact tenants were turned down.
They were clearly unprepared and unwilling and arrogant enough to say, we've done all the thinking, we don't think we need to ask any more questions, job done, we're not making any changes to this policy. So it was one of the most unproductive meetings that I've ever had in my 28 years as Chief Executive of the Tenant Farmers Association, and that's no understatement.
Well, Tom Bradshaw, the president of the National Farmers Union, described the government's position as morally bankrupt. He told Stephen Messenger they'd presented what they felt was a viable alternative plan.
Our proposal was around clawback, so that if I inherit a business and I continue operating that business, then we don't pay the tax. But if I inherit that business, and let's say it's a farm, because that's what we're representing, if I decide I'm going to cash that asset in, it's then that I potentially become a millionaire and I should pay the inheritance tax that other people should pay.
But would that raise as much tax revenue?
The modelling suggests it's relatively revenue neutral. Now, obviously, there's complexities around this, but we also know that the Office for Budget Responsibility have recognised that the current policy is very difficult to model.
The government argues they have already offered exemptions, as you say, the ability to pay back over 10 years interest-free, the fact this tax is half the rate of standard inheritance tax, and so on.
I mean, what's very clear is that they haven't modelled the affordability of this tax. I asked directly whether they've looked at how the debt can be serviced, and it's clear to me that they haven't. Now, that's very, very concerning, because we know that for many farms, this would be their whole profit for that 10-year period to pay the inheritance tax bill. Now, how does that then encourage investment in food production, investment in mitigating our environmental impact, in the infrastructure of the future? It feels to me like the government have taken food security for granted.
But if farmers are forced to sell land, surely it will still mostly be farmed just by someone else. So some would say, look, this isn't about food security. You just don't want to pay inheritance tax.
Well, I think that's very questionable, because with these tax changes, they've created another whole category of investor. The person who's going to invest up to £1 million worth of land because it's IHT free. They're taxing pensions, so there's an interest now in putting money into land rather than into pensions. And because of the small area of land that would be up to £1 million, it's not going to be a viable farm. And how much food will it actually produce?
You say the reaction from your members will be one of fury. Is that a threat?
It's not a threat, it's a reality. There are some people that are caught absolutely in the eye of this storm that were relying on the government to listen. And the government today have shut the door.
And what do you anticipate happening next? Do you support those farmers who are calling for more direct action?
There's only two ways through this, and I've been very clear on that from the start. Public support is absolutely essential, but also backbench Labour MPs. They've got to have the permission to raise their concerns with the Treasury, with the Prime Minister. And the more direct the action gets, the less likely it is that those MPs are going to be willing to raise their genuine concerns. We've got right the way through to the finance bill in the autumn, and it's only then that the decision is actually made.
Tom Bradshaw there from the NFU. We will no doubt be bringing you more on this story next week when we'll be reporting from the NFU's conference in London. Now, a topic familiar to this programme, a row over a solar farm project, specifically one called East Pye in South Norfolk, which will cover 2,700 acres across 10 different locations. Well, tensions over land use is something we've been looking at all week on Farming Today. That's the programme which goes out every weekday morning at 5:45, or you can, of course, listen anytime you like on BBC Sounds. Anna Hill spoke to David Hook, Chair of Hempnall Parish Council and Norfolk Trustee of CPRE, the countryside charity.
It's a landscape at present which is tranquil, rural, attractive. There will be continuous sections of land covered by solar panels and associated infrastructure for many miles. 22 kilometres of footpaths will have solar panels along one side or both sides, and many more kilometres will have views of solar panels.
David Hook says local people recognise green energy has to be produced. As a trustee of the countryside charity CPRE, he believes there are better ways of using solar panels on existing buildings rather than farmland.
CPRE has commissioned research with the UCL Energy Institute, and they have demonstrated that by 2050, if solar energy production from artificial surfaces, roofs, etc., is maximised, we can produce 117 gigawatts from those sources without needing any solar on land. We're not anti-green energy on any level. This is just not the best way to do it. It may be the cheapest, and it may be the easiest, but it's not the best.
A spokesperson from the Department for Energy Security and Net Zero told us, even in the most ambitious scenarios, solar would still occupy less than 1% of the UK's agricultural land, less than occupied by golf courses. We're considering ways to ensure communities who live near new clean energy infrastructure can see the benefits of this. We contacted the developer of East Pye Solar, Island Green Power. In a statement, they said the development will comply with biodiversity net gain rules to boost biodiversity by a minimum of 10%. They added that they will sow grassland between and under panels, with some areas being grazed, restore hedgerow gaps, maintain vegetative buffers, install bird and bat boxes and create new woodland blocks. But David Hook, who chairs Hempnall Parish Council, says even with landscape and wildlife mitigation, the impact of the solar panels themselves, which will be 4.5 metres high at points, will be significant.
4.5 metres is up to the soffit, second-storey height of a two-storey house, more or less. If they can be hidden behind hedges, I would be very much surprised if that could be the case. And also a few bird boxes here and there. Really, it doesn't do the job. They are not attractive features. They cannot be hidden.
David Hook. Island Green Power say the height of the tracker panels will only be extended to 4.5 metres for part of the day, and there'll be another round of community consultation in the summer.
Anna Hill in Norfolk. Well, lots of you got in touch after hearing that. Kashir emailed to say, solar panels should be on rooftops and not on the ground. Land is needed mainly for growing food and housing. Besides, fields of solar panels are such an ugly sight. Mervyn suggests looking at whether areas subject to regular annual flooding, and therefore with reducing potential for food growing, could become places for siting solar panels. He adds, I'm sure the technical problems could be overcome by suitable provision of stilts to hold panels well above potential water levels. Well, Judy says, I can't understand why any solar panels are allowed on land. We have enough buildings, car park roofs, etc., where they don't intrude. This is good farmland and where animals and wildlife lives. It should be made totally illegal, she says, to ruin what is left of our lovely countryside and farmland. Well, does a solar farm have to impinge on wildlife? A study from the RSPB and researchers at the University of Cambridge suggests solar farms managed for nature could benefit birds and other wildlife and be better for them than arable farms. Joshua Copping is a conservation scientist at the RSPB.
Those grazed by sheep throughout the year or with heavy herbicide used didn't provide much habitat for the birds compared to arable land. But when the solar farms had hedgerows and a diverse mix of flora with a high sward height, that provided habitat and room for foraging for the birds. So we saw an increased number of individuals and an increased number of species over grazed solar farms and intensive arable agricultural land.
Presumably this depends very much on the arable farm that you're comparing it with, though, doesn't it? The RSPB has its own farm, Hope Farm, largely arable, produces food and a thriving place for birds.
Yeah, and that's a good point you've picked up on. It very much depends on what you compare it to. So we compared it to farms within the fens, so not many hedgerows present and really intensively managed without much kind of nature-friendly farming. And because of that, we saw an increased number of threatened species such as yellowhammer, linnet and corn bunting. Those are the species we'd already expect to see on the RSPB's Hope Farm.
Would you be wanting to see something quite different from perhaps the solar farms that we're used to seeing on the side of motorways at the minute?
So of the solar farms I went to, it was all hedgerows were the thing that kind of drove the increased number of birds and no grazing. It was the grazing that kind of removed the long grass and seed heads that the birds were feeding on or looking for prey in. So if they're managed in a certain way, that's what will attract the species.
You could, though, manage an arable farm in that way. I'm sure organic farmers are probably shouting at the radio, pointing out that the way they manage their farms makes more space for nature.
That's a very good point. And yes, you can manage a farm in a certain way. But in this study, we only compared the intensive kind of managed solar farms with this solar farms managed with nature in mind and intensive arable. We didn't have a look at organic farms or regenerative farming practices, where you are likely to see an increased number of birds than intensive arable farms.
We've been talking this week about the difficult nature of balancing land use to try and do all the very many things we want to do from it. Are you hopeful that what you're suggesting here actually suggests a compromise, at least on one part of the argument?
I think it does. I think what we need going forward is making use of multifunctional land uses, and this shows that you can provide clean energy whilst also benefiting biodiversity.
Joshua Copping from the RSPB. Next, MPs have been debating calls to ban bottom trawling in some parts of the sea. Just to explain, this is a method of fishing where weighted nets are dragged along the seabed to gather things like scallops, sole and plaice. A private member's bill seeking to ban bottom trawling in England's marine protected areas, or MPAs, has been introduced into Parliament by Labour MP Katie White.
Destructive bottom trawling involves dragging heavy nets and metalwork across our seabed, destroying fragile ecosystems and habitats that take decades or even centuries to recover. As a fellow member so aptly put it to me, it's like ripping up an orchard to pick an apple. Just one or two trawls over an area can decimate the seabed for up to 5 years. And alarmingly, this is happening right now across our marine protected areas, zones specifically we've designated to safeguard and recover biodiversity.
According to the Marine Conservation Society, bottom trawling is currently forbidden across 5% of the UK's MPAs. A wider ban in all protected areas is something that conservation charities have been calling for some time. But Michael Kaiser, Professor of Fisheries Conservation at Heriot-Watt University in Edinburgh, argues this isn't the right approach. He's been speaking to Stephen Messenger.
These grounds are trawled year after year and they continue to produce fish in a profitable way. So if bottom trawling was having a major negative impact on those ecosystems, they would stop producing fish.
But bottom trawling does damage the seabed. You do accept that?
Absolutely. This is very heavy equipment. Organisms on the seabed will be killed or damaged and modification of the habitat will occur. But the important thing to remember is that those effects will vary depending on where that activity occurs. So in some cases they could be long-lasting, but in other cases they could be relatively short-lived, and the animals that live in those environments can be quite resilient to trawling.
People will say, though, that surely the point of protected areas is to act as a sort of wildlife reserve for sea life. And if the fish and other wildlife flourish there, then the fishing industry will benefit elsewhere.
It's important to understand that marine protected areas come in a variety of different types and configurations. One very extreme end, we have what are called no-take zones. And from these areas, all extractive activities are excluded. And these are designed to be areas where the natural system returns to something approaching its former state. But many of our other marine protected areas are designed specifically to protect either a particular habitat type or a particular group of organisms. So, for example, some of our marine protected areas are only specifically designed to protect seabirds, and so activities like bottom trawling are considered to be compatible with those areas because they do not directly affect the seabeds.
But even if they're designated for seabirds, isn't it all linked? Those birds are dependent on a thriving ecosystem below the waves for food.
It's absolutely true that there are connections throughout the marine ecosystem, but our marine ecosystems are very complex. And so the linkages between the effects that bottom trawling causes and, for example, seabirds are not necessarily that directly related.
Isn't part of the problem, though, that we don't really know how good our seabeds used to be? They've been through centuries of trawling, and we're coming at this from a point where we can't really quantify the damage and what might return if we left it alone.
Understanding what the baseline condition of the seabed is a very important point, as you rightly raise. However, we can still find plenty of areas around the UK which have not been subject to bottom trawling, and as a result, those areas actually provide that baseline reference point for us to understand what the communities would look like were we to remove bottom trawling from certain areas of the seabed.
So if fair to summarise that you think we need a much more nuanced approach to this rather than an all-encompassing ban, that you have different approaches in different areas?
Absolutely. Trawling should be removed from certain areas of the sea. However, a total ban could actually lead to unforeseen and unwanted consequential effects. So, for example, the displacement of fishing activities into other areas that would actually potentially cause more environmental damage as a consequence of needing fishermen to increase the amount of fishing activity they need to undertake to maintain the same sort of catch.
Professor Michael Kaiser. The majority of the UK's peatlands could be at risk of drying out in the next 40 to 50 years because of climate change. Well, that's according to a new study from scientists at the Universities of Exeter, Manchester and Derby. Healthy, wet peatlands are seen as part of the solution to climate change because they soak up planet-heating carbon dioxide. UK peatlands currently store an estimated 3.2 billion tonnes of carbon. But where they dry out, they become a problem because they can then release that stored carbon back into the atmosphere. The project's lead researcher, Professor Dan Beber, told Stefan Messenger that as our weather gets warmer and drier, it's less suitable for peat.
The research that we've just published essentially looks at the climate which is suitable for peat, so what we call the bioclimatic envelope. And what we find is that all of the peatland that we see in the UK exists under very wet and quite cool conditions. When we project forward into the future, we find that pretty much all of the peatland, apart from the western half of Scotland, moves outside of that envelope and into conditions where we just don't find peat. And that leads us to think that pretty much all of the peatland we have is going to become at risk of drying out and essentially losing the carbon that's stored there.
And what are the implications? What are the consequences, Dan, if vast swathes of the UK's existing peatlands dry up, as you say?
Well, historically, peatlands have been a carbon sink, which means that they take CO2 out of the atmosphere and store it as undecayed vegetation. If we reach a point where they are drying out and warming up, they will become a carbon source, and a very big one. So that's something we have to avoid if possible.
But there's quite a difficult message in there, isn't there, about where we might have to target efforts and funding in future. Are you suggesting that, we should sort of give up on certain areas and focus on the northern half of the country?
Well, it is a very difficult question to answer. I think our models are perhaps one part of the puzzle. What needs to happen next is the development of a more dynamic understanding of what conditions actually cause peat to lose carbon, either through erosion or through essentially the decay of the organic matter that's stored there. We can certainly say that if we take restorative action and try and maintain peatlands in a very wet condition, that will help protect them against those changes that we might see in future.
How worried should we be by the findings of this study?
I'm very worried about the findings of the study. It shows that peatlands are pretty much set to move outside of their bioclimatic envelopes in just a few decades. It's a carbon asset that we really can't afford to lose. Huge amounts of carbon are stored in existing peatlands. And if we have any hope of preventing the loss of carbon from those peatlands, we do need to invest rapidly and heavily in trying to maintain them in as good a state as possible.
Professor Dan Beber from the University of Exeter. Finally, I don't think I've ever introduced a report about a film premiere here on Farming Today this week before, but here we go. A Worcestershire strawberry grower says he wants to spread joy and positivity during what he describes as a turbulent time in farming, and It's a Punjabi Farm in it is the result. The film is about Bal Padder and his family, who run vicarage nurseries. Bal's father moved to the UK from the Punjab region in North India, known for its farming heritage. The premiere was in Evesham last week, and Marie Lennon went along to meet Bal.
I'm scared. Obviously, I'm scared because it's my peers, isn't it? It's people that I know and people I respect from my industry and not my industry, so it's scary.
Tell me why you've done this. Where did all of this come from?
I think my dad's got an amazing story and I want to tell it. My family's originally from Punjab, the breadbasket of India, so they came over here. The dream was factories, foundries and all that, and he ended up back to what he was roots with, the farming.
Isn't that interesting that there are so many people that would have come over from that region with so much to give and yet didn't go into farming, but your dad did?
We're farmers. We're born and bred to be farmers. Our songs are about farming, music, food, everything's about farming, and yet we come over here and we're totally different. People don't look at it as a long-term future, but it is. It's amazing. All the struggles that we have, but farmers are solid, they're strong people, they're amazing, These guys are heroes.
I fix all in the farm, drill machine, and all broken.
He break, I make, yeah?
Huh?
My name is Nigel Hart and the company is Nexus Creative. I was introduced to Bal about probably 2.5 years ago, and at the time we were talking about how we were going to market them, how we were going to sell more strawberries for them, and then having met Bal, I realised it was much more about the people on the farm than it was about the product that they were selling. Because everywhere we looked there was a story. Every person we spoke to had a really interesting background. His eagerness to tell the story about farming and to talk to people about race and how there is a lack of diversity, it meant he was going to just stand up above the parapet and bear all. And I think that's what makes this really interesting.
We want to open the gate and show you all the passion and love and the faith and the diversity that we have on the farm, and talent, the resolve, the heart, the faith, and all the exciting things that happen in the farm, the ups and downs and the disasters and the fightings and opening the gates when you're filming like we are right now.
One of the taglines of this film is that it is also about faith. How does faith inform your farm?
Everything. Faith is everything. Single most important thing up there is faith. Without faith, and I mean everybody, every grower around the world has got faith. You're playing the game, and the odds against you. But if you can beat those odds, then it's great, and that's what we're doing. We're beating the odds. That's what farmers do every day, beat the odds. I wanted to do this, not for me. I did this for everybody, every person here, to show them how exciting and wonderful farming is.
Bal Padder there, and that's it from us. I'm Charlotte Smith. The producer is Heather Simons, and Farming Today This Week is a BBC Audio Bristol production.